Um, Turn your Bibles to Judges chapter 16. Judges 16. We'll do a little review because this is part 3 in a study of Samson. Samson, there are a lot of details to his story. We wanted to cover 7 different episodes last week, and we got through 6. We did that rushing through them, and we'll have to cover the 7th one today. But that's okay. That gets us from the beginning to the end of chapter 16. But a little review is necessary because this is part 3 of Samson's story. And first of all, we've been covering this book in cycles. There are 7 cycles in the book of Judges, a nice biblical number. And we're not near the end, really. I mean, we're in the last half of the book, but there are many more chapters to this. It's 21 total, and we're getting to the end of the 7th cycle. And that's because there's an epilogue on the end of the book that kind of summarizes the moral depravity of the people during this time when there was no king and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Samson's the 12th judge covered in this book. Some people count Eli and Samuel, which I think is valid over in 1 Samuel. But if you just look at the judges in the book of Judges, you've got 12. Samson's the last. So we started out talking about unawareness. And there's a 3-part way of looking at Samson's life. Unaware, asleep, and this morning awake. Unaware applies to Samson's parents. His parents were unconscious to the spiritual realities around them. They were visited by the angel of the Lord and did not know they were speaking with God until all these wonderful things began to happen. Starting with Manoah asking the angel his name, and the angel simply replying, "Why do you ask my name?" Seeing that it is wonderful. Wonderful applying to miraculous power. And then he performed a miracle, vanished from their sight, and they knew they had been speaking with God. And so they went from unaware to aware. Then you have Samson coming into the world. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him mightily, and he performed many feats to deliver Israel from the Philistines and judged Israel for 20 years. He was asleep, though. Asleep as his parents were unaware. He was asleep physically and spiritually. And as we come to the end of that portion of his life that we're calling asleep, we learn about Delilah. This is chapter 16. So in the 7 episodes I wanted to cover last week, under the idea of asleep. Every one of these began with the Philistines coming up with a solution and Samson overpowering that solution with his strength. They come up with a final solution. Samson has fallen in love with another Philistine woman, Delilah, and they bribe her. I don't know how many Philistine chiefs there were, but each one of them went to her and said, "If you will tell us the secret to his strength, we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So 1,100 pieces of silver times however many chiefs were dealing with her is how much she could win if she turned Samson over to them. And she had this seduction on her side. That was her superpower. She thought that she could do it. The first few times she tried, though, she failed. She went to him and asked for the secret. You remember, Samson's story is full of secrets. You have the secret of the lion that he killed, the secret behind his riddle, and so on. Well, he has the secret, the main secret of his strength. And he needed to keep that secret for his own dignity and his own agency and for the sake of the people of God. And guard it. But he was allowing Delilah to toy with it. she asked him the first time, and he said, chapter 16, verse 7, "If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." So when the lords of the Philistines brought up these bowstrings and she tied him with it, she said, "Samson, the Philistines are upon us." And he broke them as if they were, the writer says, a thread of flax snaps when it's touched by the fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. She tries again. And it was really hard to understand why he let her toy with this the first time. The second time, you think, he should be able to catch on to what's happening here. There's a pattern forming. He tells her a remedy to his strength. She tries it, calls the Philistines in, and their idea is to capture him. But he keeps allowing her to play with him. So she asks him again. This time he says, "If you bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." The Philistines come. She says, "The Philistines are upon you." And he snaps them like they're nothing. Third time, "Tell me your secret." He says, "If you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and fasten it tight with the pin, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." I'm not really sure what that involves, but what is there about that suggestion that's starting to concern us? Getting closer to the secret, right? This involves the hair. She's weakening him. He is totally asleep to what's going on. He's not even trying. And so she does what he says. It involves a loom of some kind. I guess she wove the locks of his hair together. Calls the Philistines. They come in. She says they're here. And he pulls out the pin and the loom and escapes. Then she starts to press him harder and harder and harder. And the word the writer uses is she began to vex him till he was weary. And he said this, verse 17. He told her all his heart. He unbottled his heart, opened it up, and released the secret. And he said, "A razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." So she had him fall asleep, literally on her knees, and called someone in to shave the locks of his head. They paid her. And then look at the end of verse 19. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. This woman never loved Samson. He was a fool. He was never who he thought he was. And he gave her his secret. And when you give away your secret, you give away your dignity and your agency, and you allow others to have control over you. We shouldn't hide things that are controlling us, like sin. Sin is not a good thing to keep secret. At the very least, it needs to be confessed to God. And many times it needs to be confessed to others, either to get their help and to have them hold us accountable, or because we've sinned against them and they need to hear us say, "I know I did what was wrong," and they need to hear us ask for forgiveness. But there are other things, personal things, that don't need to be shared with the whole world. We talk about this with regard to social media. People overshare online. And in doing so, they give up their dignity. This is why modesty is important. Why does God want us to dress modestly? Why does He want us to cover ourselves? Because in covering up those things that only those most intimate with you should see and know you're guarding your dignity. The more you reveal to strangers, the less dignity you have. We see this with Samson. He's giving someone he thought he knew, but he didn't really know, his most intimate secret, and he couldn't trust her with it. And she took it and used it to manipulate him and control him and overthrow him. You see that happen all the time when people, especially in positions of power, give away secrets, lose their dignity, and they lose their power. So the Philistines, they come in, they seize him, gouge out his eyes, and bind him. And they put him to work grinding at the mill in prison for their entertainment. But look at verse 22. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. There's a glimmer of hope there as this unknown, inspired storyteller expertly weaves this tale for us to follow. We see in that a foreshadowing of things to come. And so now we move from the awakening, from the Samson's sleep stage to his awakening. And that brings us to how Samson failed. We're going to look at this in verses 23 and 24. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, "Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand." And when the people saw him, they praised their God. For they said, "Our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who's killed many of us." So, who's being praised? Not the true God, this God called Dagon, the one the Philistines called our God. Not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not the true God, but a false God who stands for abominable things. The ancients looked at gods this way. There's a God for Philistia, there's a God for Israel, there's a God for Egypt, there's a God for this country, there's a God for that country. And whatever nation was winning, that's the most powerful God. Now you can understand that logic if you're just making up religion without any guidance from heaven. The God of Israel was different. He expected his people to follow righteousness. And when they didn't, he backed away and allowed them to be overtaken by their enemies. This is the 7th time this has happened in this book, so we know the pattern. We know this is true. And so it's not that Dagon was more powerful than Jehovah, and it's not that he even existed. It's because Yahweh backed away and allowed his people to be punished, to refine them and make them see the error of their ways and make them righteous. But you see what happens when God's people are disbelieving and unfaithful. Their shame, in a way, becomes God's shame. Now, God has no reason to be ashamed. And this is what makes this so bad. When we don't behave the way we're supposed to, the world sees that as a strike against God and as evidence that he doesn't really exist. How many times have you heard skeptics say, if there is a God, why are his people so wicked and evil? And they start pointing out all the inconsistencies and hypocrisy and the evil that have been done in the name of Christ. And they say, this is evidence against God. Well, it's not, but that's the way people think. Let's go over to 1 Peter. Peter was very concerned with this idea. And I want to point out some things from the New Testament that relate to what's going on here in Judges, starting with 1 Peter 2, 19 and 20. Listen to the advice that he gives to servants, but to all of us, really. 1 Peter 2, 19. For this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. So he commended unjust suffering, not suffering that is fair. Because if you get punished for something that you did, it's justified and it shows that you are wrong. But if you get punished for something you didn't do, unfairly, unjustly, he said this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. Because it speaks volumes against the evil people who are doing it. And it shows the mercy of God. You are supposed to reflect God and His love and His mercy and all His qualities here on earth. People are supposed to know Him through us. And they know Christ through us because He suffered unjustly for the redemption of all mankind. Peter stays on this theme throughout his letter. And his immediate recipients, by the way, were suffering in Rome. 1 Peter 3:17, he says, "It is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil." Same idea. Go to chapter 4. Look at verse 12. "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening to you, but rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when His glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or as a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name, for it is time for the judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God?" The problem with Samson was he wasn't good. He deserved what he got. He'd allowed a woman to take the place of God in his life, and his shame became God's shame. That's how he failed. And we can't fail God that way. We may suffer, we may not have control over that, but we can control whether that suffering is just or unjust by the way we live our lives. Now, in the second place, let's look at how Samson suffered. Verses 25 and following. Well, first of all, we go back to verse 21. They gouged out his eyes. This was a common punishment in those days for people who were conquered, especially the leaders of the conquered. You might remember the Babylonians gouged out Zedekiah's eyes, the last king of Judah, before the conquest. This is something that was done. And verse 25 suggests that they would bring him out to entertain themselves. When they got bored, they'd bring out the champion of the Israelites and watch him grope around in the darkness and mock him and laugh him. So they gouged out his eyes. And then verse 21 also tells us he ground at the mill in the prison. Grinding houses were places where prisoners would grind grain for the entertainment of their conquerors. And there are different, I've seen a lot of pictures of this where Samson is pushing a lever, kind of like a mule would or some beast of burden. And because he was so strong, he would push this. But you have to remember his strength was gone. Probably what he was doing was he had a concave stone and another stone, and he'd put the grain into the bowl-like stone and take the other stone and grind the grain into meal while sitting on the dirt floor or something like that. Nothing even as glorious as pushing a lever around in a circle. He was just sitting there like any captive or slave in complete humiliation. And that was the point of it all. But you think about all the time he had to think while doing that. He's blind. There's nothing to distract him from his thoughts. And while he was grinding grain in the grinding bowl, his conscience was grinding his soul. And things were beginning to change. He was beginning to wake up. The suffering was beginning to wake him up. Any of you suffer with back pain? Does suffering wake you up? You ever woke up in the middle of the night with a headache? Or woke up sick to your stomach? It's hard to sleep when you're suffering. That's true spiritually as well. Samson had been asleep, but God had gotten his attention. And he was waking up, starting to realize the error of his ways, and he was repenting, finally. This is the first time in this cycle that we've seen any repentance among any of God's people. You'll remember it began, as all the cycles begin, with sin. They were worshiping other gods, oppression. The Philistines began to oppress them. But then you don't see the repentance, which should come next before the deliverance. Knowing that they weren't going to repent, knowing that He needed a remnant to bring His Son into the world, God delivered them graciously without them having done anything, which is how He saved us through Christ as well. Now Samson is repenting, having seen the grace of God. And he began to realize that his calling was more important than his gifts. His calling more important than his gifts. Before he'd been focused on his strength. He was proud of the fact that he could tear a lion with his bare hands, or kill 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, or pull up the gates of a city with his bare hands and carry them all the way to the top of a hill. He was performing all these acts of strength, and he'd become proud over it. That was before. Now he didn't have that. All he had was a mission. And so he began to focus more on his calling than his mission. You know, we have this problem as well, focusing on our gifts over our calling. You see that a lot in Corinthians, where they had spiritual gifts, miraculous power. The people who spoke in tongues, for some reason, received more honor than those who had other miraculous gifts, or those who had no miraculous gifts, but had natural gifts as we do. And Paul had to write them and say, there are varieties of gifts. All of them are important. You're like a body with many members, but in unity you work together for one calling, one goal. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, and so on. He said, not all of you can be an eye, not all of you can be an ear. Some of you are feet, some of you are hands. But if all were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If all were an ear, where would the sense of seeing be? You're very familiar with this analogy. Apply it to Samson. Samson was all strength, no calling. He was just spiritually blind, blindly groping about, and if he happened to be in a situation where he could kill Philistines, he would kill Philistines. But he wasn't doing it with any precision or any strategy. God was providentially leading him from place to place, and he was giving the Israelites some relief that way. But now in the grinding house, he was waking up and realizing what God had called him to do from the beginning of his life. This is the only judge who has a nativity story. We knew Samson before he knew himself. We saw him before he was born, when he was a glimmer in his mother's eye. The angel of the Lord came to her and said, you're going to have a son. He needs to be a Nazarite. You need to consecrate yourself. Bring him up for this purpose, for this mission. And then he, as a young man, became hyper-focused on his strength. And that was a problem. But now the suffering is waking him up. I think this is a good point to ask the question, why did God pick this man? And why did He give him the gift of strength? And it reminds me of an incident, I shared this in a sermon not too long ago, about Ulysses S. Grant, the general of the Union armies. He eventually became president in the United States, but he was a general of the Union armies during the Civil War. And rumors had spread that during the Battle of Shiloh, he was drunk. And historians tell us that Grant had a drinking problem, really serious drinking problem. And so you can imagine how serious a problem that is on the battlefield. He's in charge of troops. It's a life or death situation. General Grant is drunk. We don't know all the details, but the news came to Lincoln's friend, A.K. McClure. And McClure went to Lincoln and for hours laid out his case against Grant and advised Lincoln to dismiss him. This might have changed the course of the Civil War and the course of the history of the U.S. As I said, Grant would eventually become president. Lincoln thought about this for many hours, and he returned to McClure and he said, "I can't spare this man. He fights." And I think about that in connection with Samson. Maybe that was the idea that God had. He's flawed, as all men are, as all these judges have been. He's immoral. He has a problem with women. He doesn't keep his vows, but he fights. And what I need right now is a man who fights. So out of all the imperfect people, He raised this imperfect man for a purpose. But he had this calling. And it was war and it was violence, but it was a calling to deliver. And the suffering focused him in on what it was he was put there to do. And so let's talk now about the spiritual awakening and how he prayed. And I want you to see something about how well structured this book is. It's really fascinating when you start digging down into the bones of this narrative and seeing how well it is put together. So I'm going to, the story of Samson's chapters 14 through 16, if you don't count the nativity scene in chapter 13. And so in Samson's life, you have chapters 14 through 15, which we covered last week, and chapter 16, which we're covering today. If you split those into two parts, there are some really important parallels. First of all, both end noting that Samson judged Israel for 20 years. You have that as kind of a footnote at the end of each section, which tells us it's a sign that we're to look at these as two different sections, two chapters, if you will. We put the chapter breaks in after this was written. So really, the writer is saying, I want you to treat chapters 14 and 15 as a unit and chapter 16 as a unit, because they both end like that. Both describe conflict with the Philistines. That's no surprise to us. Both show Samson's attraction to women who extract his secrets. The first one was a woman he was going to marry. And at his wedding feast, he told this riddle, out of the eater came something sweet. Out of the strong came something to eat. I think that's the way it goes. And there's no way to solve that riddle unless his companions got it out of his wife. So they threaten her. She begs Samson. He finally wears him down. He tells his secret. He loses his dignity again. And we just went over how that happened with Delilah. So those events are mirrored in the two sections. And then both relate events that lead Samson to the end of his tether. At the end of chapter 15, he is losing it. He's slaughtering people in vengeance. And at the end of chapter 16, as we'll see, he comes to this place of disgrace, blind and grinding at the mill. But both end in prayer. And so that's where we're supposed to be focused. The way these lists often occur in the Bible draw our eye to the final item. You're familiar with that figure of speech. There are 6 things, no 7. The most familiar is the things the Lord hates in Proverbs 6. There are 6 things the Lord hates, no 7 are an abomination to Him. That was a Hebrew literary device that would introduce a list, but it would tell you the emphasis is on the 7th thing. And in the list of the things the Lord hates, the emphasis is on one who sows discord among brothers. So that's really what the wise man is wanting us to look at there. And you see that in the book of Amos. For 3 things, no 4, I will bring judgment upon such and such a nation. Over and over again you see that. And it says, look at the 4th item in particular. Well, here's a list of parallels. And it's not introduced. There are, how many items are on this? There are 4, no 5. You don't have that introduction here. But both of them end in prayer, which is to tell us the writers really want us to focus not on Samson's time that he judged Israel, not on the conflict itself, not on the violence, not on the bloodshed, not on the immorality and the attraction to foreign women, not on Samson's blowing up, but on his prayer. So look at the prayer at the end of chapter 15. He has just killed 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, and that's exhausting, and he's dying from thirst, and he's very thirsty. Verse 18 says, and he called upon the Lord, and he said, you have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant, and shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? And that's when God split a rock and brought water out, as He did during the wilderness wanderings for the Israelites. Not only does the miracle itself show you that God is on Samson's side, but it's a sign of deliverance because it makes us think about the wilderness wanderings and how He preserved them. Now, at the end of chapter 16, he prays 2 prayers. Here's the first prayer, verse 28. Samson called to the Lord and he said, O Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Look at the word where it says, only this once. Can be translated, only this time. That is a noun that shares a root with a word translated stir at the end of chapter 13. And when we talked about that chapter, I talked about that word a little bit. Let's do a little review. Go back to the end of chapter 13, verse 25. And it says, the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in these places here that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce this morning. It began to stir him. That verb, stir, has the same root as the noun where he says, one time. And it can mean to drive, to compel, to force, or to pulsate. And a lot of people think that this violent, intermittent pulsing is the idea behind that, which is very different from the way the Spirit worked with the other judges. In chapter 3, Othniel, it just says, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him as if it rested on him and stayed with him throughout the rest of his life. With Gideon, it says, I think this is chapter 16, the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon, enveloped him. Like it is said in Galatians 3:27, that everyone who's baptized into Christ has been clothed with Christ. So Gideon was enveloped by the Spirit, and the Spirit stayed with him, we assume, throughout the rest of his judgeship. Jephthah even, it is said of Jephthah in chapter 13, the Spirit of the Lord was upon him. That's not the way the Spirit worked with Samson. After it is said, He began to stir him, pulsate within him, here and there, forcefully and violently even. You see 3 times this phrase, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. Chapter 14, verse 6, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. Chapter 14, verse 19, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and he took the garments from the men he killed in Ashkelon and gave them to the companions at his wedding. In chapter 15, verse 14, one more time, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him before he killed 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, and then fell exhausted on the ground, dying of thirst. You see the difference? With the other judges, the Spirit seemed to descend and rest on them. With Samson, it pulsed. And now, at the end of his tether, verse 28 of chapter 16, he says, just one more time, let your Spirit pulse in me. Give me one more shot. And verse 29 says, he grasped the two middle pillars on which the house rested and leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. And then came his second prayer. Let me die with the Philistines. Verse 30 continues, he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. And so let's close with how God delivers. He brings the house down, literally. And the writer says that, this is still verse 30, the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he had killed during his life. The dead he killed in his death more than those he killed during his life. Remember what I said. Before, he was focused on his strength, and he was just randomly bringing deliverance here and there as the Lord's providence led him. Killing 30 men from Ashkelon to get garments to pay for losing the challenge about the riddle. Burning down the fields by tying foxes' tails together with torches and sending them out into the fields. Killing 1,000 with the jawbone of a donkey and more. But nothing with a lot of planning and execution. But now, the Lord uses him in this rather strategic thing. This is a rare day when many people are gathered together for a festival. They bring him out. He brings the house down on them and kills himself and more Philistines than he killed during his lifetime. And that self-sacrifice should make us think of something else. Jesus did more works with his death than with his life. He healed many people during his lifetime. Even though it was very short, healed many people. But when he died for the whole world. This is what Hebrews 2:14-15 says. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. When we read Samson, we shouldn't just look at this as a story about a strong man. This is a story about God's deliverance and how he asks the ultimate sacrifice of his deliverers. This is foreshadowing the only real deliverance that ever came, the death of his son Jesus on the cross of Calvary, who gave his blood, not in violence, but in grace, which opened the door of salvation not just for the people who were there, not just for one nation, but for the whole world. Through death, he delivered all who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. And that's the way we should read the story of Samson. That concludes the 7th cycle. We've got one more week to cover chapters 17 through 21, and that's impossible. So unfortunately, we're going to have to summarize that, but Of all the material, that's really what I'd prefer to summarize because there's some really ugly stuff in those chapters. I think I'm going to call that lesson Monstrous Sin, because that's the point of that two-part epilogue at the end of the book of Judges, where the key theme comes out: every man did what was right in his own eyes. That's all the time we have for this morning. Appreciate your attention.